Hi, welcome everyone. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Just want to give everyone a chance to get online. Okay, I see more people coming in, so I'm just going to get started because we only have an hour, but welcome. This is the fourth session of our Affordable Housing 101 Back to Basics series. Today's topic will be covering the phases of affordable housing design and navigating entitlements. And we have three wonderful folks from RRM Design Group who will be leading our presentation today. I'll let them get started in just a second. As a quick reminder, please put all of your questions in the Q&A box. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of the session. I'll be prioritizing questions in the box as opposed to the chat. And this session will be recorded and the slides will be sent out after the session later this afternoon. So to get to our speakers today, we have Linda Blackburn, who's a principal planner with RM Design Group, Rachel Hollander, who is a senior planner, and Sarah Shelton, who is an architect, all at RM Design Group. So I'll let them get started.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks to the SCAMP team for reaching out to us to lead today's webinar. So as Danielle mentioned before we get into some introductions, we wanted to see who's in the virtual room. So Danielle's going to put up a poll for folks that have that capability on their laptop or computer to participate in our poll so we can understand who's in the virtual room today. So, our first question is which best describes your current involvement in affordable housing? And there's a variety of options. I think it's only single choice, so maybe pick your preferred if you identify with more than one of the options. And then, secondly, the second question is how long have you been actively involved in affordable housing? So, we'll give it a little bit to give folks maybe a little less than a minute to answer, just so we can kind of get an understanding. I think this is helpful for us as speakers speaking on this particular topic to understand familiarity. Danielle, I'm not seeing if the results are being shared quite yet. I don't know if we have to wait till folks finish responding.
Yeah, I can share them though. I'll end the poll.
Okay. Alrighty, so we had majority of folks for question number one identified as an affordable housing developer, owner, or operator, which is great. And then a couple other categories in the high teens with resonating with government agency, consultant or service provider, or other. And then there are some policy advocacy or research. Love it. I'm also identify as that besides just being a consultant. And then we have a small percentage in the elected officials office. And then number two, looks like we have a nice range of years of experience of being involved in affordable housing with a majority in the 0 to 2 years, and then some sprinkled throughout the 2 to 5 and 5 to 10, and then 10 plus. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for participating in the poll. That's just like I said, helpful for us to kind of see who's in the, well, of course we can't see you because it's a webinar, but just understand who's in the meeting room. So as Danielle mentioned, we are doing a webinar on the phases of affordable housing design and navigating entitlements. Um, So moving onward, we're going to do a quick brief introduction of each of our speakers. So I will start us off. My name is Rachel Hollander. As Danielle mentioned, I'm a senior planner at RM Design Group. I am in our planning and urban design work group and currently work in our Ventura and Santa Barbara offices and help support our design team through entitlements. I predominantly work on entitlement projects that incorporate or that propose affordable housing or multifamily with usually some mixed income type projects, and work in a variety of areas across up and down the state, predominantly in the Central Coast, and like in the Inland Empire area, which I know touches on in the Scamp region. So I'll turn it over to Linda to introduce herself.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Blackburn. I am a principal planner with RM Design Group. I have worked in both the public and private sectors for almost 20 years in planning. My public experience has been at both the city and county agency levels, and previously did work in a all-in-one development, construction, and property management company. With that background, I leans towards relationship development with design teams, in addition to across the counter, and looking at things from the perspective of eventual operations and how the front end of design and development contributes to the programming goals of an operator or property manager. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you both. I'm Sarah Shelton, architect and project manager here with RRM Design Group. And I also work predominantly on affordable housing projects, some 100% affordable housing projects, some with market rate components as well, and mostly in the Ventura and Santa Barbara region. And I also do quite a bit of work in the Inland Empire and greater LA area, and I've worked kind of up the coast all the way up to San Luis Obispo area. So I'll keep my introduction brief and pass it back to Rachel.
Thank you. Alrighty, just a quick little bit about RM Design Group if you're unfamiliar with us. We are a multidisciplinary firm headquartered in San Luis Obispo. However, we have offices up and down the state, as high up or as north as the Bay Area up in San Leandro, and then as far as south as San Diego, and then with our newest addition in Seattle, Washington. So like I mentioned, we have architecture, civil engineering, landscape architecture, structural engineering, planning and urban design, and in-house surveying. So just kind of wanted to note that we have a wide breadth of affordable housing projects up and down the state, as well as reflected by our little heat map on the right side of the screen. So moving into our agenda, what we're talking about today. So we are tasked with sharing the phases of the entitlement process and navigating that sometimes arduous process, as well as the design that comes through that process naturally with our architecture, civil engineering, landscape, and other design teammates. So we're going to do a quick little, we've already kind of covered the introduction. We're going to really dive into a quick overview of the entitlements process, kind of focusing obviously on the meat and potatoes, the middle section of that, of the entitlements or planning approvals through the jurisdiction. Going to touch on a little bit of the before and after, just to kind of recognize the full scope of what's involved with these types of projects that we're discussing today. And then really to kind of share or have a better understanding of how that process actually gets played out. We have 3 case study examples that we thought would be really kind of avail the audience to better understand like what we're talking about in terms of how it's not always a formulaic approach to each project. Each project has its own nuances. Each jurisdiction has potentially differing, policy constraints or other different requirements. So it's kind of it's always a case by case basis. And then we want to reserve some good time at the end for questions and answers. So please put any questions in the Q&A tab of your Zoom dashboard. Questions can be put in through the course of the presentation, But as I mentioned, we'll reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. And then we'll have a quick closing remarks, sharing our contact information for any latecomers that didn't hear Danielle's updates. The slide deck of the PowerPoint will be provided after the meeting, and our contact information from Sarah, Linda, and I will also be shared. Alrighty, so Entitlements 101. We are talking a little bit about land use entitlements. Is the process of securing, necessary approvals, usually planning approvals from the local jurisdictions, planning department and other departments that have purview of these projects. There's a lot that goes into the process of just beyond navigating, zoning or municipal code, design requirements that pertain to or that would apply to a project. There's everything from environmental regulations that could also apply. And environmental analysis that has to go into these types of projects. And then there's also the things that are sometimes a little bit more surprises in terms of community concerns that, or just community engagement is another item that we'll be discussing today. So like I said, our hope and intention is just to do a quick blush of the entitlements process and overviewing that and the different phases and steps that it involves, but then really diving into the case studies. So want to note that some of these things were covered in session 3. So we'll definitely kind of blush through them and spend some more time at the end, kind of how they were put into practice on those particular projects. So due diligence is a term that is often used for understanding existing conditions, understanding the regulatory framework or policy framework for certain projects, as well as understanding if proposed uses are permitted, and if they are, what their necessary permitting pathway is through the local jurisdiction that you're working in. So I included a little graphic of a lot of jurisdictions these days have these interactive GIS maps, which are super helpful. They show a lot of different information. On here is an example of one that shows some hazard in regards to some floodplains. So those have been extremely helpful for us as architects and designers and planners, understanding some of the regulatory requirements on the projects and sites that we work on. Building kind of further into the due diligence process that usually happens at the beginning of a project. Just recognizing the different types of policy documents or codes that reign or apply to these different properties that we're talking about and working on. So just recognizing that a jurisdiction is required to have a general plan, and that has a whole host of different elements, or I refer to them also as chapters if folks don't know what a element is, but there's different different elements that are encompassed within a general plan. And so, and then there's also municipal or zoning codes that prevail on a or that apply to a project. So then just kind of moving forward into a typical project schedule. So this is just kind of noting that it's a typical process, but not always followed to a T every single time. Sometimes it doesn't happen as linear as you might want it to, but just recognizing the due diligence or kind of understanding of existing conditions flows into concept design. And then really what we're going to hone in on is the planning, approval, and entitlements process. And then funding is a huge component of these affordable housing projects, and then followed by the post-entitlement work, which we are not going to focus as much on in this session, but will be forthcoming in, I believe, the subsequent and final session. Concept design, this is a super important kind of starting of the process. It helps to establish key design parameters and requirements with not only the client or the operator, but the community and then the jurisdiction as well. And then flowing into, we're kind of calling it pre-entitlement work. I don't think that's an official term, but that's what we're coining it as. And so that can look like a formal application, whether it's a pre-application, a planner consult, something with the agency to share the concept design and really get some understanding and confirmation of the entitlements process ahead of you. I think this has been a key tool to RM success on the projects that we've worked on. Most of our projects do start with a pre-application or some form of verification and coordination with the local agency to better understand any late hits in the process and try and get in front of those. Like I mentioned, starting engagement with the community and or other stakeholders, whether that's community members, internal team members who are going to help with the operation of the project. And then, as I mentioned, understanding funding sources, as a, internal team, understanding how the project's actually gonna, get built and operated. Linda, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel, for setting that up. So after the pre-entitlement stage, it would be the entitlements. There's a lot that goes into schematic design and the entitlement process, so I won't touch on all of them, but overview some of the main elements, which would be assembling a good team, some key milestones, and some obstacles and challenges. Next one. So assembling a successful team is kind of like a recipe, selecting the right ingredients. The main part of the design team is the consultants, which would be made up of architects, civil engineers, landscape architects, land use planners, and specialty consultants like traffic engineers or biologists. This team actually draws up the plans, pulls together the entitlement package, and submits to the government agency. The other component of assembling a good team would be to get the property managers involved on the front end, if those are known who's going to be in the operations side of things. Their contributions to it can help identify potential future operations concerns, and we'll go into some of those specific examples of how that can be really helpful. The last part is the construction and contractors. This can often be overlooked as part of the team as well. This can be really valuable in the design process because they have a good pulse on like lead times for certain construction materials, or if there's a potential cost-saving alternatives to designs. Many times designs can look really good on paper, but can be very costly to construct, or there could be an alternate design proposed to avoid these late cost hits. So the entitlement milestones would be the submittal package, the application deemed complete, the environmental review, and public hearings. And so the submittal package involves the plans, the project description, an application, studies or reports, and most importantly, fees. All of these agencies collect fees. Once it is submitted, there is a review process that is established, and the maximum review is 30 days in accordance with the Permit Streamlining Act. And there are other regulations that get involved in that, but there is a 30-day review process to deem the application complete or incomplete. And it would be the unicorn of a project if it only went through one round of review and got deemed complete the first round. So there are typically multiple rounds. Once the application has been deemed complete, there's environmental review under the provisions of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. There are different tiers, as Rachel mentioned, of environmental review, but the intent is to go with the lowest level of environmental review, which would be exemptions. A lot of the projects that we've worked on can get exemptions for infill. It just depends on the site location. Once the environmental review has been completed, then you get to the public hearings. And unless it's ministerial, there may not be a need for public hearings, but many times there are. And that would be the Planning Commission hearings, City Council meetings, or Board of Supervisors. Some of the obstacles and challenges with the community engagement that Rachel mentioned, it's good to get them involved earlier in the process, such as community workshops or pop-ups, which is a much better alternative than hearing the airing of grievances at a public hearing. And then as far as local, state, and federal guidelines and regulations, they don't always align and can definitely be in conflict. So it's really great to do that due diligence on the front end. And I will go ahead and turn it. Oh, I'm sorry, post entitlements. What's next? Briefly, it's the plan check process, permit issuance, construction, then on to occupancy, which will be covered more in depth in the next stage of the web series. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Linda. So yeah, this takes us right into the case study portion of our webinar. So we've got 3 case studies lined up. We tried to choose a variety of projects with different obstacles, ones that had kind of different factors in the entitlement process to give folks a kind of a better glimpse of the brief overview we just gave of the process. All 3 of the case studies we chose are in Ventura County. That being said, we feel like they do exemplify kind of similar processes we've seen in the greater LA area, but they are all in Ventura. So the first one we wanted to talk about is Mountain View Apartments. So this project is located in the city of Fillmore. And next slide, thank you. So this project is 77 units. It is 100% affordable housing, family housing typology, and it consists of both stacked flats as well as townhomes with garages. And the funding source for this project utilized a variety of kind of loans and TCAC programs, and it was a partnership between the Area Housing Authority of the County of Ventura, as well as a nonprofit developer, Many Mansions. So lots of players in this one, and a kind of complicated fee structure like we see for most affordable housing projects. And with that, I'll hand it back to Rachel to kind of walk through the entitlement process for this specific project.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So as I mentioned, or as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to review a little bit of the entitlements process for Mountain View Fillmore. And so this one was not able to take any, we did apply state density bonus law to get an increase in the number of units on the site, but there was no ministerial process to secure planning approval. And so we had to go before, we had to do what's called a general plan amendment to change not only the land use designation, but we also had to do an accompanying rezone to rezone the site as well. And so those are all legislative acts that trigger, in this case, it was city council review by the City of Fillmore City Council. We started though with a pre-screening, since that was a requirement by the city for all general plan amendments, had to go through a pre-screening process, which went through Planning Commission and then subsequently City Council, which was blessed, and we proceeded with the formal application for the general plan amendment. We also, so the other required actions were, there was kind of a lot for this one. The legislative actions that I mentioned with regards to changing the general plan land use designation and the accompanying zoning designation as well. There was also an alley vacation that we had to proceed with vacating. It's right here if you can see my cursor, but obviously we wanted to vacate that. No additional entrance to the site from Highway 126 was desired by the city, so we decided to remove that access point. There was also a lot merger and a lot line adjustment that we had to proceed with processing concurrently with the approval of the proposed land use. There was also some land dedication that the landowner and or that the client had to proceed with dedicating to the city for additional right-of-way, not only along Highway 126, but also along Mountain View Street and Santa Clara, and those were for additional sidewalk. With as well as a multi-use trail. And then, as I mentioned, there was a state density bonus law application that we submitted to get an increase in the number of units. Not sure the familiarity of state density bonus law. On some other projects, it's been very successful in availing us to apply concessions and development standard waivers to particular design standards from the jurisdiction that are maybe inhibiting the affordable housing project. So you're able to waive those. And based on the number of affordable units, you get a certain number of concessions, and then you always get unlimited development standard waivers. So that's been honestly a really nice tool to seek relief from certain standards that are challenging to meet. And then, as Linda mentioned, the environmental review on this, the city conducted what's called an initial study to analyze the level of impacts that the project might have on the environment. Under the California Environmental Quality Act, there's certain topics that you go through in terms of like potential resources that might be impacted by a project. And so for this one, just wanted to note that we prepared, along with the applicant, prepared a noise study given the adjacency to the highway, which provided in a recommendation to construct a 6-foot tall barrier. They were pretty nondescript with the design and materials of the barrier, but there is a sound wall out there today. And then we also were required to provide a cultural resources report, as well as a traffic study to analyze potential traffic or cultural concerns, and all of which warranted in all less than significant determinations for each of those different categories or potential areas for impact. And then finally, since this one did, as Linda mentioned, once it goes through the deemed complete 30-day review process, goes through environmental determination and review, we were ready to go through public hearings. And so this one not only had to go to Planning Commission, Planning Commission made a recommendation for approval to the City Council, but ultimately the City Council made the decision to approve the project for all those required actions that I discussed. Just wanted to note a couple caveats about the planning, or not caveats, but just the conditions of approval that the Planning Commission rendered on the project. Conditions of approval are something that most planning projects, especially that are discretionary and that go before a formal review or public hearing process, get conditions of approval, and each condition has a specified timing that you have to satisfy it. And so some of those are tied to prior to getting a building permit. Some of them are tied to different sequences throughout a project's completion, whether it's, like I said, building permit issuance, or potentially even prior to construction activities, or maybe even certificate of occupancy. So just wanting to recognize that even once you have your entitlement approval secured, there are still some things that need to be satisfied post entitlement through those conditions of approval. I'm going to hand it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, the next item we wanted to hit on for this case study is the design evolution of this project. So this was something that was very key to the eventual success of this project. And I think the success of a lot of projects. And kind of something that we see either as an obstacle or strength in the process for a lot of projects, in terms of how smooth the process will go. So we did a pre-application for this project. So we had a very high level of collaboration with the city and community on what the design of this development would look like. And it evolved a lot and many times. So we started with maybe more of a Monterey style, shifted to craftsman, had some ag influence at later points, some kind of Western rail influence at some point. So there's a lot of feedback from the city, which we worked closely with to really fine tune the design of the development and make sure that it was satisfactory to the design review board for approval. And this was something that because it was so embedded in the conditions of approval for the project and the approval in general, it's something that really stuck with the project throughout construction. So as the project evolved, it was became very important for us to stick to kind of our final result extremely closely. So the level of development of the initial design was important because we had to essentially follow what we said we'd do for the project to be successful. All right, next slide. So yeah, that ties into lessons learned a bit. So the first lesson learned is kind of making a plan for addressing all the conditions of approval. So this is usually a very lengthy document, and each one of these items has different lead times. So there's a few conditions on this project that were had a longer lead time than we initially anticipated, which just resulted in a lot of negotiation further down the line with the city. One of those being some of the right-of-way improvements in coordination with Caltrans. Just anytime you've got anything in a right-of-way improvement, it takes a while. So that needed to be addressed very carefully and tracked very carefully. Another lesson learned that I think is helpful to pay attention to in terms of the design early on is site accessibility and parking. The parking is, set in stone into the project data, and depending on if you're assigning parking or not assigning, or have carports or have EV chargers, that affects the layout of all the ADA stalls and is hard to change in the future if you don't have tolerance, and then can result in changes to the design or needing to submit substantial plans for substantial conformance. So that was something we had to work through. And that ties into also building in design tolerance. So we had a lot of very specific design features that the city was really excited about, but when push comes to shove, some of the trusses had to change a bit. You don't have structural involved early on all the time. So there are things that we all understand change from conceptual design to the construction document level. But having enough design tolerance to absorb some of those changes while keeping the aesthetic in line with the city's requirements was key. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to Linda for just some general tips on property management coordination early on.
Some examples could be when you involve the property managers or operations early on. They can identify things such as with third floor, you have a third floor and there's trash that is a little bit further away from a property, and then there's carpet. They could say, don't put in, the carpet. There are trees that are identified maybe on the site because the city's requiring to keep the trees, but they know that from a management perspective, there are things that fall. There's a lot of landscaping maintenance that goes into that. They have the on the site and on the ground type of experience with those. One last example would be that if there are amenity facilities and there's a pool or a fitness center and they're both located in the same general vicinity, but you want to keep those access points separate because one closes before the other, and kind of identifying those on the front end so that you don't have to rearrange the plans later on to have those different access points. Back to Sarah.
Thank you, Linda. All right, so our next case study that we wanted to review is Sespe Ranch farm worker housing. And I'm gonna do my best to fly through this because we are starting to get crunched on time. So next slide. So this one is a 360 unit farm worker housing development, 100% affordable, deed restricted farm worker housing. The reason we wanted to share this project is it kind of uses a pretty interesting planning route. So this is on agricultural exclusive land and utilize the Farm Worker Housing Act. And the funding source that utilized tax credits and a variety of loan programs. And then the entitlements was done between a partnership with nonprofit affordable housing developers. And then once entitled, it was sold to a developer and operator. So during the entitlements process, this one had a lot of steps we had to go through, so it needed a plan development permit. We also needed to get a conditional use permit for a wastewater treatment plant. So something interesting about the Farm Worker Housing Act is that in order to be eligible for it under the Ventura County Ordinance, the existing lot had to be non-conforming, so it was under the 40 acres. It was 36 acres, so we met that portion of the requirement. It was also required to be near a city sphere of influence, so this one happens to be directly adjacent to the city of Camarillo. But something that affects is how the wastewater is handled. So because it is not in the city of Camarillo, even though that's the nearest place where the sanitary water would go, we were not able to, Camarillo was not able to serve this parcel. So for part of the project, we had to build a wastewater treatment plant, which required a conditional use permit. So I mentioned that as just a note to, it was something that definitely played into the feasibility of the project, both with fees and cost of development, and also the length of the project for permit processing. This project was, we also did a tentative parcel map, so it was split into 4 different parcels with the intent of a different operator potentially having ownership of each parcel. And then we also went after density bonus and affordable housing incentives allowed for this project. So in order for it to be feasible, some of the waivers we used was we increased the allowable building lot coverage. We were also able to reduce the required side setbacks. And we were also able to get a waiver for reducing Quimby fees, which are parkland dedication fees. So because this project included a lot of on-site amenities, we were able to get that number down and make it feasible. And next slide. So some key challenges, and I already went into these a little bit, but water was really a big one. Is how do we serve this project with water, and where does the wastewater go? Another challenge was public perception. I think tends to often be a negative perception with affordable housing, unfortunately. So in order for this project to get approved through the design review committee, it took a lot of kind of education and coordination and just collaboration on the design and what the intent was and the quality of housing provided and the quality of operation that would be on site. And then the third kind of challenge that isn't necessarily unique to this type of project, but I think does play a part in projects of this type was the soils. So because of the long history of agricultural use, there's a lot of fill on the site. The soil was also extremely moist, so they had to do a lot of excavation and removal of the existing fill and then bring in a lot of new soil. We also had to do a cement mix with the soil and then do post-tension slabs. So it was definitely something that had an impact on the kind of fees for the project, and another reason why it was important for us to get a waiver for increased lot coverage to make this project feasible. And lessons learned. So one lesson learned on this one is at the time of entitlements, we did not know who the operations team would be. So there's a lot of design aspects that changed in the final design. So building in some flexibility to the original design was key, and having the ability to move parking around down the line, move laundry around down the line was very key in the project's success. We were able to get a substantial conformance review for the updated design once the operations team was brought on board. but I think, yeah, having some of those flexible spaces from the get-go was helpful. And then we also ran into some challenges with changing city staff, and making sure that any areas that we were negotiating were, consistent, had consistent interpretations when staff changed. And I'm gonna kind of run right through this because we are running short on time. So let's go to the next one with Rachel.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I'll just echo that though. Any sort of jurisdictional staff or fire department, get everything documented and in writing should staff people change with who you're working with, and especially if you're getting some exceptions to certain standards and requirements. So our third and final case study is Rancho Sierra Senior Housing in the county of Ventura, located off Lewis Road, just south of the city of Camarillo. Again, as Sarah alluded, we don't only work in the Ventura County, but just thought this was a nice range of types of projects and how they did go through the process, and they also characterized different targeted demographics of who these projects are for. So this is a permanent supportive housing for age restricted, for the age restricted demographic, so 62 years and older. It's 100% affordable. It's at 50 units, 49 one bedroom units, including on top of that a one unit, 2 bedroom manager's unit to be on site. This was also a variety of funding sources between TCAC, or the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee, and then there's also some HCD, No Place Like Home funding, and then there was also some local county home funding secured for this particular project. And then this was also a partnership structure between Many Mansions and the Area Housing Authority of the County of Ventura. What was interesting was that this actually this property for the Rancho Sierra project is actually part of a 50 plus acre larger County of Ventura owned property. So the Ventura County Behavioral Health Department issued an RFQ for a housing development on the site, in which Many Mansions and the Area Housing Authority of the county responded to that RFQ and were selected. And then they entered into a exclusive negotiation agreement with the county for a long-term land lease of this particular project site, but it's not really its own site. It has lease boundaries that were recorded with the county, with their other leaseholders on that site. So this is an interesting one in terms of the entitlements. I mentioned the ENA agreement that the developer team coordinated with the county, and that was also really important to get their, what's called, and what's kind of been coined in my understanding of the last 8 years of doing this, is what's called site control. And so I know that's been extremely important for our projects that are trying to secure the tax credit funding, and through that application process, I believe that's a requirement. And so that's how they were able to get, site control, was through that ENA and then developing those lease boundaries. The processing pathway for this one was I kind of threw out some verbiage earlier and just want to revisit the difference between ministerial and discretionary. So a ministerial process, the most basic way of saying it is just it's easier and should be shorter than anything that has a discretionary process tied to it. And so that means that this was ministerially approved by the Ventura County Resource Management Agency, or essentially their planning department. There were other departments and external agencies that reviewed the project, because there's a lot of other departments that go into that completeness review that Linda was characterizing. Even though the planning agency or division acts as like the lead agency, you're usually working with a case planner from their development review division. But then those case planners on the county or cities end route plans to building and safety, public works, transportation, and the list goes on and on. And so even though, yes, this was a ministerial application and only required county departmental review. So we just had to comply with the different design requirements from the county and those various departments that I characterized. The reason why we were able to process this project ministerially was through a through a state law called Senate Bill 744, which allows for permanent supportive housing to be considered a permitted use or permitted by right use in a zoning district that allows multifamily and mixed uses. And so this is zoned residential plan development in the county of Ventura. And so since that particular zone allows for either multifamily or mixed uses, this proposed use is allowed by right. And then just wanted to touch a little bit on some design constraints that I'll also touch on a little bit in 2 slides from now, but wanted to characterize, I mentioned the site is part of a larger county-owned property, and so there was some factors to consider there. There was a master plan that RRM was also working with the County of Ventura on to kind of look holistically at the site as as opposed to just kind of how it has been developed over time in kind of a piecemeal fashion. So that was a definitely a factor at play. Another design constraint was water service. That was probably our biggest issue that we ran up against, was coordinating with the water district out there that provides water or is the water purveyor for this portion of the county. And so really working with them to understand if they were able to serve the number of units proposed. And then I did see a question in the chat about community outreach, and usually it's not required on affordable housing projects, but I definitely have found that it has been a best practice for RRM to suggest to our clients, as well as our affordable housing partners have just started integrating it into the project schedule and starting as early as you can in the process to really bring the community, immediate neighbors along through the process. Because not all projects require a public hearing, as this one did not, but I always think it's in your best interest when you engage your neighbors to avoid any kind of late hits or complaints, whether through the planning review process or through construction, of just establishing good good partnerships through the process. Just wanted to give a minute to our building elevations included too for context. I'm going to keep speeding through so we can get to our Q&A segment. Spoke to a couple of the other design factors. Not all of them were constraints, but definitely things that we needed to consider through the project. And so what's interesting is if you were to look at a land use or zoning map, this site is, as I mentioned, it's residential plan development, but completely surrounded on all 4 sides by agriculture designated land. And so the County of Ventura has an agricultural buffer policy, which we had to adhere to. And provide some fencing and landscaping, and actually the parking lot at the front of the site helped add to that barrier where we needed to provide the setback or buffer from. The other interesting item is that this entire site is in a floodplain. And so it's in FEMA's special flood hazard AE, which means that you have to which requires all new structures to be raised 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So we worked with our survey and civil engineering team to determine what that 1 foot above base elevation would be to really set where those buildings would need to be, and in terms of our grading plan and what that looked like. And then just wanted to also note that this one we worked through because we had our operations team and the client on board, and they were really looking at a way to expedite our construction timeline. And so they decided, as we were still working through our planning approvals and entitlements, that they were going to work with a modular manufacturer. So this is actually the first multifamily modular development in Ventura County, and helped save, we kind of estimated up to like 6 months on construction timeline for having those modular developed offsite and then brought ready to the property. And I think we are to our Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, Sarah, and Linda for your presentation. And now we'll get started on our Q&A. So first question, this attendee said, I noticed on the Fillmore project that part of the funding was from a nonprofit. Is RRM a nonprofit developer? They ask because they're trying to understand affordable housing for their neighborhood council duties and wanted to see if it makes sense for a for-profit developer to build affordable housing.
I'll have, or Sarah, you want to?
Oh yeah, I can take this. So no, we are not RM does not do any, we're not a developer. So the nonprofit developer we worked with on this project was Many Mansions. That being said, we also have done affordable housing projects with for-profit developers as well. So we've seen it done both ways, either nonprofit groups or for-profit developers.
Okay, great. Next question. On Mountain View, you mentioned you tried the state density bonus, but ultimately ended up doing a GPA. Do you think you lost time by pursuing the density bonus first? And if so, how much?
Thanks, Danielle. Good question, Joe. So this one, we didn't try doing the state density bonus law first. It was actually part of our general plan amendment application. Oftentimes these projects, they have not just one application that you have to fill out and that's tied to the project. It's multifaceted. So for that one, we filled out a state density bonus law application, filled out a general plan amendment application, and a rezone application. There's other applications out there that sometimes you have to fill, and so you kind of get a lot of different permit numbers tied to your project based on the different applications that are required. Hopefully that makes sense, but it wasn't like we tried out state density bonus law and figured out that didn't work. The state density bonus law application availed us to increase the number of units proposed because it was an affordable housing project. So as I kind of tried to characterize based on the level of affordability or units dedicated or reserved for, at a affordable income level, you get certain percentages allowed to increase your total number of units.
Thank you, Rachel. Next question. Is the wastewater treatment plant a closed system, as in it only serves this one development and isn't large enough to support future growth around the site, or can it serve more in the future?
Thanks, Danielle. I can take this one, and that is a great question. I am actually unsure on the answer. What I can share though is that it was specifically designed for this development only. That being said, I don't know if it has additional capacity. There is space around it, so I imagine it could serve additional development, but the it's unlikely that there would be additional development near the site, just because of kind of how the language is for the Farm Worker Housing Act. And so I don't know if the adjacent sites would qualify for it. So more or less it's for this site only.
Okay, great, thank you, Sarah. Next question, does by right mean council cannot deny the project?
Great question. So usually if a project is by right, it would not go before the city council or any sort of decision maker that could deny it. A by right project would only be subject to what I characterize as that ministerial process, so would really be at the discretion of staff. And there are very stringent findings under a variety of state laws that we have applied on these projects that would really allow or avail a jurisdiction to deny a project. I have found that it's very difficult to make those findings.
Great, thank you. And then the next three questions are all kind of about modular building. So the first one specifically asks, who did the modular construction manufacturing and how early did they start giving your design team input for cost, offsite constructability, transportation, stacking, etc.?
I will admit that I am not the best person to answer that. So, Michael, if you do want to follow up with us offline, I can put you more in contact. I am more familiar with our weekly meetings that we had, particularly for the Rancho Sierra project, where our construction team really they did all of the offline coordination with the modular manufacturer and relayed, and we coordinated those sequencing things that you had kind of questioned about, not only the cost and, you know, we had to press the go button on getting the modular units constructed. Essentially, I believe it was a little at risk as we were still going through the plan check process through building and safety to work to get our building permit, which is pretty common. I've done that on some smaller projects where like maybe an ADU has been modular. Um, so I don't remember the name of the modular manufacturer. Again, that coordination was largely coordinated by our construction management team.
Great. And then the next two questions about modular development. One is just if you could share more about modular developments. And then maybe the second question that you could put into your answer, is modular building a factor considered in the entitlement process?
Yeah, I can try and cover both Josh and the anonymous attendee's question about modular. I think it's definitely a newer component and factor that our clients are considering. I think what things that I've experienced, and it's largely been on the ADU realm of things for ADUs that I've helped process, um, is that it still requires, my understanding is that any prefab or modular requires, well, at least sorry. I think it's just a changing and evolving nature is kind of my experience, and giving enough lead time for it to be constructed if it's an out of site or excuse me, out of like state warehouse, which I believe the manufacturer for the Rancho Sierra project was. And so you had to think about time to construct those units off site and then also get them to the project site. So I think there was a question about transportation. So there's just a lot of coordination in terms of, you know, when to press the go button in terms of like, is it at, are you constructing these units at risk before you have either your planning approval or entitlement approval, or maybe it's while you're going through the plan check review process. So I think those are all questions that, you know, people in our shoes can help kind of strategize with, but it ultimately came down to um, our client's decision of just understanding, you know, kind of timeline of securing their funding for the project, whether through funding methods that they were applying for or trying to coordinate with the local jurisdiction to get. So just kind of, I think it's a strategy call in terms of understanding where you're at in the process and how risky it is to proceed with that. Um, so I can't speak to every kind of scenario, and I've only seen it on a couple of different projects. There are a couple local manufacturers that we've looked into at the direction of certain clients at RRM, but largely have done more of the stick built. And then, or sorry, Danielle, I was gonna skip to the next one.
Yeah, and then MJ is asking if you could please repeat the Senate bill that you noted in the answering about the buy rights entitlement process.
So that was SB 744 for the Rancho Sierra project.
Okay, and we have, let me see, we got quite a few. I think this is going to be our last question. We still have a few about modular. So the one I'll link these two modulars together and we can finish out on that. One was, and you might have mentioned this in your last part, but how did you store the modules locally? And then how significant are the shipping costs if you know those?
I cannot speak to the shipping costs, but I do know that on the Rancho Sierra project, um, I believe many mansions worked with the county of Ventura to negotiate an agreement to store um, those units in an adjacent location, right adjacent to the actual project and area of work.
All right, well, that concludes our Q&A so that we have 1 minute left. I just want to thank everyone for joining us for today's session. Again, I'll be sending out the recording and the slides and information for Sarah, Rachel, and Linda after this session later this afternoon, so check your inboxes for that. And I'll hand it off to RM to do their closing remarks.
Thanks, Danielle. And thanks to the SCAMP team for having us today. Excited to be a part of today's session. Looking forward to our, I believe, the last session that's on Thursday regarding, or that's about managing construction and post-construction operations. So thanks all for the time. Hope you have a great day.